Welcome back. Until now, we looked at a lot of services related to user, to retrieve users, to create a user, to delete a user. One of the things which we are not doing right now is validation. So user has a name. We don't validate anything on the name. User has a birth. I've not validated anything in here. Validation is quite a common requirement in all these services. In this step, we'll look at using Java Validation API to add validations on our beans. When we get a request to create a user, we would want to validate the content, and if it's invalid, we would want to return a proper response back. Let's get started with that. I would want to enable validation on this specific user. So what I would need to do is add in something called @valid. This is an annotation which is present in Java X Validation API. This is defined by the Java Validation API. We already have the Java Validation in API and its default implementation in the class path because of something called Spring Boot Starter Web. That's the starter we are making use to develop these REST services. We'll talk about that at the end of this video a little more. For now, let's focus on adding the validation. So @valid and user. Now I would want to add a validation on the name. I would want to say at least name should have 2 characters. Let's add that in. So I will say @size. So I would want to put a restriction on size. You can see it's coming from package Java X validation and constraints. So we are using the Java validation API. So @size, and if I look at the attributes which are in there, you can see that there's a minimum attribute. I'm going to say @size minimum is equal to 2. The other thing I would also want to say is this should always be in the past. A birth date cannot be in the future. So I would say @past, and I would import the constraint in. Now I've added the constraints in. I've added the @valid annotation on the request method. Let's see what happens when I fire in a request. So I'm saying localhost 8080 users. I'm sending a post request body. I selected raw and we chose JSON application JSON. And if I send a proper request, let's say Ranga, and he was born in 2007-19, and send it, this gives me a proper response back. It says 201 created and the resource is created at user/4. The location header is also coming back. Let's say I'm putting just R and sending it. Now you see that I'm getting a 400 bad request because we have added in the validation. That's pretty cool. The fact that we are validating it, it's very good. But if a client gets this response back, 400 bad request, if I look at the body, there is nothing in here. If I look at the headers, there's nothing here. All that they get back is 400 bad requests. So what is bad? What is the error that is happening? How do they know about it? Now we have added in the validations. The validations are working. But we need to always, when we create services, when we create RESTful services, we need to think about the consumer. So how does the consumer know about what is wrong? So what we'll do is we'll add a simple message. Think about where we would add it. We already created some exception handling, right? Where did we create it? That's right. It's customized response entity exception handler. We are extending response entity exception handler in here. One of the methods which is defined in here is something called handle method argument not valid. So this is the method which is fired when a binding to a specific method argument fails. So what we are trying to do is binding to a method argument, right? So we are trying to get the request name and birth date, and we are binding it to the user object. And at that point, we have a validation error. This is the thing which is triggered when that happens. So what we'll do now is we'll override this. So I'll copy this method into the customized response handler. And now I would want to override this. So @override. That's cool. So now I would want to override this method. Over here, I want to create my own exception definition. I copied the default implementation we had from earlier. The message is fine. All that I would want to change is give the consumer the details of what has went wrong. And that's stored in something called binding result. So get binding result. That's what has the details of what went wrong. So let's put get binding result dot toString in here. So we are actually creating a binding result.toString and we are sending it out. The other thing is this is HTTP status. It's not found. It's bad request. So this is bad request and we are returning the details of the binding back. Let's see what happens when I execute the request again. Bad request. What does the body contain? Okay. The body contains the message. Validation failed for argument at index 0 in method so and so with one error. In the details, also there are a lot of other details which are being sent back. One of the important things is we are sending a lot of information out to the consumer right now. So the consumer has a lot of information which is present about the validation error. If you look at the response right now, it's actually having a lot of duplication. Message and details have almost similar kind of details, and I wouldn't want to send so much information out in the message. So for this specific scenario, what I'll do is customize the message. So I'll say exception.get message. I'll say instead of sending that, I would say validation failed. Wait for the server to restart, and I'm going to send the request again. So this is cool. So now I have a timestamp. Message is validation failed. The details of the validation failed message are in here. So user and name and rejected value is so and so, and you have the arguments. There are a lot of details passed in. This might be useful for the consumer. You can further customize these details as well. What I'll do is I will go to the user object and you can add in a customized message. So I can say min is equal to 2 and you can say message is equal to name should have. I'd want to add a simple message. Name should have at least 2 characters. And I'm saving this. Wait for the server to restart and execute it again. Now you can see that the message is coming out. It's saying name should have at least 2 characters. That's the one which has failed. This exception message is still providing a lot of details. You might want to still customize it further and play around with the binding result. So what you can do is actually go to the binding result class, and you would see a lot of things which are present inside the binding result dot class. I can say something like get binding result dot get. You can say all errors and loop around all the errors and just print the message as well. So there are a wide variety of things that you can do with the validation messages. Right now we are giving a lot of details back. You can actually customize the whole thing so that you can actually return just the validation error messages back. The validations which we have used in this specific step are add size with an attribute min, and we use an attribute called add past as well. I mean an annotation called add past as well. This checks if the birth date is a date in the past. Anything greater than today's date would result in a validation error. All these validations are defined in something called validation API.jar. We are using Java validation API. We are using version 1.1, and what we are looking at right now is what are the different validations which are implemented in there. If I look in the constraints package of the jar, you'd see that there are a lot of other validations which are defined. You have assert false, assert true. There is a max min for decimals. So you can say the maximum value is 10, minimum value is something. And you have digits, number of digits that can be defined. You can say that a date should be in future. And you have not null and null as well. So you can say a specific field should always be null, or something a specific field should always be not null. And we already looked at the past. We looked at the size as well. And the other one is to enable us to define a regular expression pattern. So this string should match this regular expression pattern. The Java validation API defines all these validations. I mean, the most popular implementation of validation API is Hibernate validator. So Hibernate validator implements whatever validations are defined in here. We are getting these two jars because they are defined as dependencies in Spring Boot Web Starter. We are developing a RESTful web service and we are using the starter Spring Boot Starter Web, and that's how we get these two jars related to validation. You can see that the fun part of working with Spring Boot is the fact that we can directly get into using the framework. We don't really need to worry about configuring it or something like that. All that we needed to do was open our user bean, define the validations, and then we went to the user resource and put in an annotation called @valid on the request body. That's all we had to do to get all these validations working. In this video, we started with talking about how to add validation about users, and at the end, we were able to customize the whole thing so that we can give a proper error validation message to the user with a status of 400, which is bad request. Until the next step, bye bye.